At the end of World War II, the United States didn't just win the war at sea, it mastered the very process of building sea power. American shipyards had become a machine that could turn steel into fleets at a speed no other nation could match. By 1945, U.S. shipbuilding output had reached a level that wasn't simply impressive, it was overwhelming. The United States had produced thousands of vessels during the conflict, including cargo ships, tankers, landing craft, escorts, and major warships, enough to supply a global war across two oceans. Entire shipyards ran day and night, and in places like the West Coast, the shipbuilding rhythm became so efficient that standardized designs like the Liberty ship could be produced at astonishing rates. In practical terms, this meant the U.S. could do something no enemy could counter for long: replace losses faster than they could be inflicted. It wasn't just naval strength, it was industrial inevitability. And that industrial dominance helped the U.S. Navy become the world's leading maritime force, projecting power across the Atlantic, across the Pacific, and into a post-war world that would soon revolve around American sea control. But history has a way of shifting quietly. Dominance doesn't always disappear in one dramatic moment. Sometimes it fades through decades of small changes. Factories closing, shipyards shrinking, skilled labor aging out, and supply chains drifting overseas. And that's exactly what happened. Over time, the United States went from being the undisputed center of global shipbuilding to becoming a minor player in commercial ship production. Meanwhile, across the Pacific, another industrial giant was rising and building. China, which at the end of the Chinese Civil War had limited industrial capacity and almost no meaningful modern shipbuilding base, has since undergone one of the fastest and largest industrial expansions in human history. And shipbuilding has been one of the clearest signs of that rise. Today, China holds a dominant share of global shipbuilding tonnage, with enormous shipyards capable of producing both commercial and military vessels at a pace that has alarmed planners in Washington. China's navy has also expanded rapidly, not just in number of hulls, but in capability, with modern destroyers, frigates, submarines, and aircraft carriers being launched in a steady rhythm that reflects something deeper than defense spending. It reflects industrial power. And this is where the conversation becomes serious. Because in a future conflict, especially one in the Western Pacific, it's not enough to have the most advanced ships if you can't replace them. In war, ships break. Ships get damaged. Ships get sunk. And the side that can repair and rebuild faster gains a deadly advantage. That's why shipbuilding capacity isn't just an economic statistic anymore. It's a national security issue. The uncomfortable reality is that America's shipbuilding base has narrowed dramatically, while China's has grown into a vast industrial ecosystem. In many estimates, China's shipbuilding capacity far exceeds that of the United States. And while the U.S. still maintains major strengths in quality, technology, and global operational experience, the gap in industrial throughput is the kind of gap that can decide long wars. This growing imbalance is one of the main reasons the U.S. Navy has begun pushing what it describes as one of its most ambitious modernization and shipbuilding efforts in decades. The plan is not simply about building a few new ships. It's about reshaping the Navy for the type of war planners fear most, a high-end conflict across the Pacific, far from U.S. shores, against a near-peer opponent with massive industrial depth. That kind of war will be defined by distance, by logistics, by submarine threats, by missile salvos, and by the brutal reality that a fleet can't operate at peak tempo forever without maintenance, replacement hulls, and supply ships feeding it. So the Navy's modernization effort isn't only about firepower. It's about endurance. It's about staying power. It's about whether the U.S. can maintain a forward naval presence and sustain combat operations, even if the conflict stretches from weeks into months or longer. And that urgency is now being reflected in budget planning and shipbuilding priorities. Over recent years, the Navy's shipbuilding requests have fluctuated, but the trend line in Washington has become clear. The U.S. is trying to accelerate production, expand capability, and invest in the types of vessels most useful for a Pacific fight. Submarines remain at the top of the list because they are among the most survivable and lethal assets in the region, capable of operating inside contested zones where surface ships would face heavy missile threats. Destroyers and large surface combatants remain essential for missile defense and strike capability. Amphibious ships, landing vessels, and logistic ships are also becoming increasingly important because the Pacific isn't just a battlefield. It's an ocean of supply lines. If those supply lines break, the fleet loses its reach. And the Navy knows that. But even with money and political will, shipbuilding isn't something you can turn on like a switch. Building ships takes years. Training welders and engineers takes years. Expanding dry docks takes years. And modern warships are among the most complex machines ever built. That means the Navy's modernization plan is not just a military program. It's an industrial revival attempt, a push to rebuild capacity that has been shrinking for decades. And this is where the real challenge begins, because America is trying to close a gap that has been widening since the Cold War ended, while China has been scaling up its shipbuilding base as part of a national industrial strategy. So the question is no longer whether China is building faster. That part is already clear. The real question is whether the United States can modernize quickly enough to maintain dominance where it matters most, and whether it can do it in time. Because the Pacific doesn't reward late preparation. If the next conflict comes before shipbuilding capacity is restored, the U.S. may be forced to fight with what it has, not what it plans to have. And in naval warfare, that can be the difference between controlling the sea and being pushed back from it. Now, before we go deeper into what exactly this modernization plan includes, what kinds of ships are being prioritized, what programs are being expanded, what is being cut, and why, we need to understand something crucial. This isn't just a story about budgets. It's a story about industrial momentum, about how the United States once built fleets as if it were routine, and how that ability gradually slipped away. Because if you understand what America had in 1945 and what it is now, you'll understand why Navy leaders are calling this moment historic. And if you're interested in real military history, real defense strategy, and the decisions happening right now that could shape global power for decades, make sure you're subscribed, because the next part of the story explains exactly how the U.S. shipbuilding base declined, how China surged ahead, and why the Navy is now making moves that could redefine the balance of power across the world's most important ocean. For most Americans, shipbuilding feels like a distant industry, something that belongs to old photographs, World War II documentaries, and black and white footage of sailors waving from crowded decks. But for military planners, shipbuilding is not history. It's the foundation of everything. Because no matter how advanced your missiles are, no matter how elite your sailors are, no matter how smart your commanders are, if you can't build ships fast enough, you don't control the ocean, you borrow it. And in a long war, borrowed power runs out. After World War II, the United States held a position that was almost impossible to challenge. The country had massive shipyards, deep pools of skilled labor, and a supply chain that could feed production of fleets. The U.S. Navy was also operating from a position of total dominance. It had carriers, battleships, cruisers, destroyers, submarines, and perhaps most importantly, it had experience. It had fought a global naval war and learned lessons written in blood. For decades after 1945, that advantage carried over into the Cold War, where American sea power became one of the main pillars of global influence. U.S. carrier strike groups weren't just weapons. They were floating messages. If one appeared near your coast, you understood what it meant. America could reach you. But while the Navy remained powerful, the shipbuilding ecosystem that supported it began to shift in ways most people didn't notice. During wartime, shipbuilding was a national emergency. During peacetime, it became a business, and business follows cost. Over time, commercial shipbuilding increasingly moved overseas, especially to nations that made it a national priority. Japan surged first, then South Korea, and eventually China. These countries invested heavily in shipyards, industrial clusters, and the workforce needed to build ships not only cheaply but fast. The U.S., on the other hand, began to lose that industrial rhythm. Shipyards consolidated, orders slowed, skilled labor became harder to retain. And as commercial shipbuilding faded, the industrial base narrowed until military shipbuilding became the main focus. And that's a dangerous position, because it means your entire shipbuilding industry depends on a limited number of expensive contracts and a small number of facilities. And here's where the strategic problem becomes clear. In the modern era, shipbuilding isn't just about how many warships you have today. It's about how quickly you can replace them tomorrow. A navy is not just a fleet, it's a pipeline, and pipelines can dry up. China understood this better than most. In the decades after 1949, China wasn't just trying to modernize its military. It was trying to become an industrial superpower, and shipbuilding fit perfectly into that plan. China poured resources into shipyards, modernized its production methods, and built the kind of industrial ecosystem that creates momentum. When you have dozens of shipyards, thousands of subcontractors, and a workforce trained specifically for maritime manufacturing, you can produce ships like a conveyor belt produces cars. Commercial ships first, container ships, bulk carriers, tankers, and then, once the system is mature, military ships become easier to scale because the heavy infrastructure is already there. The cranes, the dry docks, the steel processing, the logistics networks, all of it exists. It's not built for warships alone. It's built for volume. And volume is power. That's why the rise of China's navy cannot be separated from the rise of China's shipbuilding industry. One feeds the other. Every time China expands shipyard capacity for commercial production, it increases the national ability to build and maintain warships. Every time it trains more workers, it deepens its industrial bench. Every time it refines manufacturing processes, it reduces cost and increases speed. It becomes a cycle, and the cycle compounds. This is how you end up with a country capable of launching modern destroyers and frigates in numbers that would have taken other nations far longer to match. Meanwhile, the United States began to face a different reality. Fewer shipyards, fewer skilled workers, longer production timelines, and higher costs. Even when the U.S. decided it needed more ships, the system struggled to scale. A modern warship is not a simple build. It's not like the Liberty ships of World War II, where standardized designs could be churned out rapidly. Today's ships are packed with advanced radar systems, missile launch cells, electronic warfare suites, stealth shaping, network combat systems, and highly specialized engines. Every delay in one component can stall the entire ship. And when you have fewer shipyards and fewer suppliers, there's less redundancy, meaning the whole program becomes fragile. This is why the shipbuilding issue has become so urgent. It's not just that China has more ships. It's that China can build ships at scale, and America cannot easily surge production the way it once did. That matters because in the Western Pacific, the battlefield is shaped by geography. The U.S. would have to fight far from home, across thousands of miles of ocean, in an environment where bases and ports could be threatened by long-range missiles. China, by contrast, would be operating closer to its industrial heartland. In a conflict, damaged Chinese ships could potentially cycle back into nearby repair facilities faster, while U.S. ships might need to retreat across the Pacific for major repairs. That distance becomes a weapon, and when combined with industrial capacity, it becomes a strategic advantage. So when U.S. Navy leaders talk about modernization today, they aren't just thinking about the next ship. They're thinking about the next decade. They're thinking about a world where the Pacific could become the center of gravity for global power. And they're asking one question that keeps coming up behind closed doors. If the unthinkable happens, are we ready? Because readiness isn't only measured in how many ships you have on paper. It's measured in how many ships you can keep operational under stress. It's measured in how quickly you can repair battle damage. It's measured in how many submarines you can keep at sea. It's measured in whether your supply ships can keep the fleet fueled, fed, and armed. And it's measured in whether your shipyards can handle the tempo of war, not peacetime schedules. This is why the U.S. Navy's modernization plan isn't just about new ships. It's also about the industrial base itself, about rebuilding the ability to produce hulls, to maintain fleets, to sustain readiness. In other words, it's an attempt to restore something the U.S. once had naturally, the ability to outbuild and outlast anyone. But the modernization plan comes with a hard truth. Even if Congress approves every dollar, even if every program runs smoothly, the U.S. cannot rebuild shipbuilding capacity overnight. It takes years to expand dry docks. It takes years to train a workforce. It takes years to establish new supply chains. And the world isn't waiting. China's shipyards are already operating at scale right now. The gap is not theoretical. It's measurable, and the clock is ticking. Which brings us to the most important part of this story. What exactly is the U.S. Navy building and why? Because the types of ships being prioritized reveal what kind of war the Navy is preparing for. Some platforms are being accelerated, others are being reduced, some programs are being rethought entirely. And if you know what to look for, the shipbuilding list reads like a strategy document, a blueprint for how America plans to fight if the Pacific becomes the main battlefield. Now here's where the story stops being abstract and becomes real. Because when the U.S. Navy announces a modernization push, it's not just a list of ships on paper. It's a signal, a warning, and depending on how you read it, it's also a quiet admission that the Navy believes the next fight won't be like the last one. It won't be a slow build-up over years. It won't be fought in safe waters. And it won't be won by prestige platforms alone. It will be won by survivability, logistics, and the ability to strike first and strike again from inside a contested ocean. That's why the U.S. Navy's modernization plan is increasingly shaped around one hard reality. In the Western Pacific, surface ships are exposed. They're visible. They're trackable. And in a region saturated with sensors, satellites, drones, and long-range anti-ship missiles, a large ship isn't just a weapon, it's also a target. So the Navy's approach is shifting toward what can survive in the most dangerous environment on Earth. And at the top of that list is the submarine. Submarines are the closest thing the modern Navy has to an invisible blade. They don't need air superiority. They don't need escorts. They don't announce themselves with radar signatures and towering superstructures. They move quietly, strike without warning, and disappear again. In a Pacific conflict, submarines will be tasked with doing the most brutal work imaginable: hunting enemy warships, cutting supply routes, sinking high-value targets, and forcing the enemy fleet to operate in fear. This is why attack submarines have become one of the Navy's most valuable assets, and also why they are one of the most difficult to produce quickly. They take time. They take skilled labor. They take specialized components. And they require shipyards that can handle complexity. That's why the modernization plan isn't just build more ships. It's build the right ships and fix the bottlenecks that prevent us from building them. But submarines alone can't win a war. A fleet is like a living organism. Submarines are the claws. Destroyers are the shield. Carriers are the striking arm. But none of it matters without the bloodstream, the supply ships. And this is the part of naval warfare most people overlook, even though it decides who lasts longer. Fuel ships, ammunition ships, replenishment oilers, cargo vessels, repair tenders, transport ships. These are the vessels that keep the fleet alive. A destroyer can fire its missiles in minutes, but it takes weeks or months to replace those weapons. A carrier can fly sorties nonstop, but without fuel and spare parts, its air wing becomes useless. In a Pacific war, the U.S. would be operating across vast distances, and the logistics chain would be under constant threat. So modernizing the Navy isn't only about building more destroyers or submarines. It's about ensuring the fleet can stay in the fight without collapsing from exhaustion. That's why the modernization plan includes not only combat ships, but support ships too. Because in the Pacific, the side that runs out of fuel, ammunition, or spare parts first loses. It doesn't matter how brave the sailors are. It doesn't matter how advanced the technology is. A warship without supply is just steel floating in the ocean. And then there's the surface fleet, the ships the public recognizes, the ones that dominate headlines. Destroyers, cruisers, and large combatants. These ships remain essential because they carry the missile defenses that protect the fleet. They also provide long-range strike capability, launching cruise missiles that can hit targets hundreds or even thousands of miles away. In a modern conflict, destroyers are not just escorts. They're mobile missile batteries. They defend against incoming threats. They hunt submarines. They track aircraft, and they strike land targets. They are the Navy's workhorses. But they face the same problem as everything else. They take years to build, and the shipyards that produce them are already strained. And this is where the modernization plan becomes controversial, because modernization isn't only about building, it's also about cutting. The Navy has to make choices, and those choices reveal priorities. Certain programs get delayed, some get restructured, Others get scrapped entirely. Not necessarily because they're bad ideas, but because the Navy is trying to focus on what can be fielded effectively, at scale and time. In other words, the modernization plan isn't just about ambition. It's also about realism. Because the enemy isn't waiting. China is building at a pace that forces uncomfortable comparisons. New hulls enter the water regularly. Modern shipyards produce ships in parallel. Entire industrial zones exist to support maritime manufacturing. And while the U.S. still has critical advantages, experience, alliances, technology, global reach, China has one advantage that becomes terrifying in a prolonged conflict. Depth. Industrial depth. The ability to keep producing. That's why the modernization plan is not just a military plan. It's an industrial race. But rebuilding industrial strength comes with obstacles that don't make headlines. The first obstacle is workforce. You can't build a fleet with spreadsheets and speeches. You need welders, electricians, engineers, pipe fitters, quality inspectors, ship designers. And these are not jobs you can fill overnight. Skilled shipyard labor takes years to develop, and once lost, it's hard to replace. The second obstacle is supply chain. Modern ships require advanced electronics, propulsion systems, radar arrays, and missile launch infrastructure, and many of these rely on specialized suppliers. If a single supplier fails, the entire ship can be delayed. The third obstacle is shipyard capacity. Dry docks are limited. Facilities are aging. Maintenance backlogs can consume the same infrastructure needed for new builds. And that creates a cycle. Ships stay in maintenance longer than expected, which delays operational readiness, which increases pressure on the remaining fleet, which increases wear and tear, and the backlog grows. This is why the modernization plan is described as historic, not because it's the first time the Navy has asked for new ships, but because it's a recognition that the U.S. needs to rebuild the foundation of naval power itself. Not just ships, but the ability to produce ships reliably, the ability to maintain them quickly, the ability to surge if necessary, the ability to sustain a long fight if deterrence fails. And there's another layer to this story, one that's easy to miss. This isn't just about a ship count. It's about strategy. For decades, U.S. naval strategy was built around the idea of forward presence, keeping powerful forces deployed globally, ready to respond. But the Pacific challenge is different. The Western Pacific is not just a region. It's a fortress of geography and missiles. It's an environment where bases can be targeted, ports can be threatened, and fleets can be tracked. That means the Navy's modernization plan is also about adapting to a new type of war, one where dispersal matters, where smaller platforms may play a bigger role, where unmanned systems may expand surveillance and strike capacity, and where the fleet must be able to operate even when traditional assumptions break down. In other words, this modernization plan is not simply about building the Navy of today. It's about building the Navy that can survive tomorrow. Because if there's one lesson from history, it's this: nations don't get to choose when they're tested. They only get to choose whether they're prepared. And the reason this decision matters so much is because the stakes are enormous. The Pacific isn't just an ocean. It's the economic bloodstream of the world. It's where global trade moves. It's where alliances intersect. It's where power is measured not by words, but by presence. And if the balance of naval power shifts permanently, the world changes with it. So the question is no longer, should the U.S. modernize? The question is, can it modernize fast enough? Can it rebuild shipbuilding capacity before the gap becomes irreversible? Can it maintain technological advantage while closing the industrial one? And can it do all of this while the world grows more unstable by the year? Because in the end, the country that controls the sea doesn't just control shipping lanes. It controls the future. And now I want to hear what you think. Do you believe the U.S. can realistically rebuild its shipbuilding industry to compete at scale again? Or do you think the gap is already too wide? And if a major Pacific conflict happened within the next 10 years, which matters more, having the most advanced ships or having the ability to build and replace ships faster than the enemy? Drop your answers in the comments. I'm genuinely interested in what you think, because this topic affects the future of global power more than most people realize. And if you enjoyed this breakdown and you want more military history, strategy, and real-world defense analysis like this, make sure you leave a like. It helps more than you think. And subscribe so you don't miss the next video. Because the next era of naval power is being decided right now, and the world is watching.